Hey, welcome to the DataONE webinar series. It is my pleasure to invite Cynthia, Vitale, Hannah, Hadley, and Lisa Johnston to be our first speakers of the 2019-2020 webinar series. And they are going to be collectively talking about data curation primers, expanding the community curation network. Before we get started, I just want to tell you a little bit about DataONE. You may be new to DataONE, you may be familiar with us through our webinar series. The mission and vision of DataONE is to enable new science and knowledge creation through universal access to life about data on Earth and the environment that sustains it. We provide an infrastructure that supports networking across data repositories, as well as a lot of education tools and resources. If you are interested in looking at the members of our network, the repositories that are part of the DataONE network, of which there are currently 42, you may look at this URL, dataone.org/current-member-notes. And if you are interested in searching for data that is available across the network, then you can use our search tool at search.dataone.org. As I mentioned, in addition to infrastructure, we provide a wide variety of education materials. We have a suite of downloadable PowerPoint materials that speak to data management across the data lifecycle. It's a set of 10 education modules. Each of these is accompanied by a one-page synopsis that can be used for high-level education points and also hands-on activities. And most recently, these materials have all been transferred to our Skill Building Hub, which is a GitHub-based repository that you can fork and adapt and use for your own purposes. In addition to education modules, of course, we have the webinar series, which you're familiar with because you're here attending. And you can follow us on Twitter at dataone.org. In terms of the webinar series, you can find all of these URLs to be useful. We have information on all of our webinars. The upcoming webinars will always be at upcoming-webinar extension on our URL. And we have all of the recordings available for viewing afterwards. So this webinar will be recorded and put up at previous webinars later today. And you can also take a look at all of the other webinars since 2015 that we have had being hosted. And with that in mind, I just want to mention that next month's webinar is focusing on Wholetail. It will be stories or publication of tales to DataONE member repositories through Wholetail, and that will be given by Bertram Ludischer. And for some reason the date is not there, but it is October 8th. I apologize for that. And one last request before we get started is that in order for us to maintain metrics on the number of individuals, we know that some of you attend the webinar as part of a group. So if that is the case, if there's more than one of you at your monitor right now, then please do put that number into the questions box, and that enables us to kind of get accurate viewing numbers. In addition, I should mention that any questions that you have during the webinar, please also post those into the questions box. We won't be turning on microphones, and I won't be interrupting the presentation, but I'll hold all of the questions until the end, and then we can have a discussion based on those questions at the end of the webinar. So without further ado, again, the title is apologetically wrong on this. That is not the title of the webinar. We are welcoming Cynthia, Hannah, and Lisa. Cynthia Hudson Vitale is the head of research informatics and publishing at Pennsylvania State University Libraries, and she's a founding member of the Data Curation Network. Hannah Hadley is also at Pennsylvania State University Library, and she is the project manager for the IMLS DCN Data Curation Training Grant, which is focused on data curation education workshops. Lisa Johnston is principal investigator for the Data Curation Network. She is director for the data repository for the University of Minnesota, DRUM, where she coordinates the library's efforts around data management, research data management. And without further ado, I'd like to pass over to Lisa, who will be leading the presentation on the data curation primers.
Great, thank you so much, Amber. I'm going to try to share my screen now. All right. Does that look okay?
Yes, it does. You can see it.
Great. Go to full screen. All right, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be able to present to the DataONE community today on what the Data Curation Network has been up to, in particular, our efforts around sharing out what we're calling these data curation primers, which my colleagues will go into a lot more detail in. But first, I'll just give a brief overview of the Data Curation Network to date and a little history of who we are and what our mission is. And then I'll turn it over to Cynthia, who will introduce the work that we've been doing with the support from the IMLS on educating the community and offering workshops on data curation. And then Hannah will present on some of the outcomes from these educational workshops, the data curation primers themselves. So first, just introducing who we are. The Data Curation Network is a Sloan-funded project that launched in 2016. We received a planning grant from Sloan and have been implementing the Data Curation Network since 2018 with a new phase that just launched, a 3-year project that launched in 2018 through 2021. We currently have 10 member institutions. All of these institutions you'll see here. There's a sweet little graphic that'll happen. We are mostly academic library data repositories, but we also have one general data repository, which is Dryad, of course. And each of us hosts a data repository that our either affiliates may deposit data to, or with Dryad, they're available to open to anybody for deposit. And the main challenge that we're focused on is really just trying to share our data curator staff across all of our different repositories, because not each of us can supply enough data curators or data curation expertise to cover the wide variety of data sets that are coming to our institutions. Each of us are multidisciplinary repositories, and we see everything from genomics to forestry to humanities data sets to social sciences, so it really is quite a gamut to cover. So for that, we bring together each of the data curators at across all of the 10 repositories to really band together and share expertise. So what we are representing today is about 35 people in the network who are doing this work, who are doing the data curation work. And how it works is that the data curation network really helps each of our repositories better enable researchers to share their data in ways that make them fair. So data curation itself, in our view, is really enriching those data sets as publications to ensure that they're fair by adding or finding missing information, missing files. We often work with authors to create documentation for their data sets. When a data set comes to us, we'll review it to see if there's anything that maybe is unclear for a user, unclear codes. What does a blank cell mean, for example? Work with them to build README files and to create documentation that would ensure that the data could potentially be reused. But we also do screening for privacy disclosure. We will ensure that any data derived from human subjects is being shared in accordance with their participant agreements. We also work on any code or quality assurance issues. So for example, we'll run the code that might come to us in association with a data set, or maybe that is the data set, the code itself is the data. And we will see if that data will run on our local machine and, in maybe a potentially different, slightly different environment. We also make recommendations for file format transformations. This is often done in consideration of long-term preservation decisions that might need to be made by the repository. So we'll recommend transformations if it's a proprietary file format, for example. Then we work with the author to arrange or describe their files. And finally, we also review and augment the metadata. That is also a very important task that we take on. So this is a data curation network formulated in recognition that there are so many different types of data and that the data themselves are quite unique and valuable. I don't think I need to go into that too much with this audience, but we wanted to really support data sharing in ways that benefit the author of the data, but also the potential future users of the data. So some of the things that we really think about is curating data for reuse, ensuring that the data are reusable. ensuring that the data have enough context and documentation. We also think about the reproducibility of the data. Can somebody else really run these files in the future? We also think of data curation as a way to help avoid retractions. And this has really come up in context of individuals who might have to share their data in association with a publication or meet a journal data sharing policy. And data sharing also increases reputation. It builds trust, it builds transparency, and the data sets themselves can be cited as first-class digital objects. So the vision for the Data Curation Network as a project is to provide these data curation services for all of our network partners, to share our curation expertise, to be able to send a data set to the network and get it curated by an expert in that field or in that particular software expertise. We also have other goals, though. We are providing professional development opportunities for our emerging data curator community. So this includes our workshops. We also train our data curation staff and bring people together annually to talk about ways to share different techniques and different data curation tools. We also are researching the ways that data curation have an impact on that final data set. So are well-curated data more valuable than non-curated data? Are they used more? Do they get a greater number of citations, a greater number of downloads? So that's one of the areas that we've been tracking. And then finally, we are looking to really expand this project beyond the grant-funded phase to be able to continue this work and to bring on new partners that would expand our ability to curate all the variety of data sets that we're seeing. So all of these different vision areas translate into kind of these top main priorities for the DCN right now. So we're doing curation, we're doing education, we're sharing out our best practices in the form of these primers that we'll describe today. We're doing R&D, and we're working through a sustainability plan. So those kind of are our key areas in this particular phase of the project. And then the value proposition. We always have to consider why we're doing this. And I like to think that the value of doing data curation is always because of it will result in better data. But the reason for doing it as a network and as a partnership between multiple institutions, I think is really becoming clear to us that we ourselves are being able to share out on best practices and create better best practices here locally than we would have been able to do just by ourselves. It also kind of extends into the broader set of research data services that each of our institutions provide. So by collaborating on the curation aspects, we're seeing areas of opportunity to better align or understand some of our services in other data areas like data management or data management plan support, data visualization, the list goes on. We are also community-led infrastructure. Each of us are really trying to provide a great service for our researchers at a very low, reasonable costs that are not for profit. And then also the value of the Curation Network is that peer-to-peer learning piece where we are sharing and educating each other. So here's the look of the DCN right now. We have subject expertise, as you can see here in each of the different institutions. This is sort of a visualization of some of the expertise. We also have a lot of software expertise, particular individuals who are really expert at running our code or running databases, for example. So when we receive, when one of the institutions sends a data set into the network, it is reviewed by our DCN coordinator and assigned to the appropriate curator in the network who has that subject and hopefully also the software expertise to curate the data set. Part of the training that we provide to all of our curators are called the Curate Steps. These are a way for all of our curators to have a baseline number of actions that everybody takes when you review a data set. And we train all of our curators in on this curate model. And each of the Curate steps has a checklist that goes along with it to give that baseline of action that every data set can do. However, I will note that when you receive a particular data set, it's really going to depend on the software or the format of the data, on kind of the detailed level of how you approach it. You're going to be curating a GIS data set differently than you might curate an Excel file, for example. It really does have a lot more detail. And that's really what Hannah and Cynthia are going to talk about with the primers. And then just a snapshot of where we are right now. Since we started actually curating, we had the DCN planning phase, we had to put everything in place, and then we started curating data sets in January 1 of this year. So we've been up and running for about 8 months now, and we've curated 50 data sets within the network. And you can see here some of the statistics about the submitted data sets in orange. These are the data sets that are coming to us. We're seeing code, we're seeing some of the more specialized file formats like simulation data or 3D image data, and how that matches up with the experts in the network. So I will move along here and pass this over to Cynthia to talk more about how we are educating the community about DCN and Curate.
Thank you, Lisa. And let me again extend my thanks to those of you who have joined us to learn more about this project. It really is a community initiative and a community resourced sort of project. So if you see things here that you're interested in, please do reach out to get more involved. And Hannah will cover this as well, but I just wanted to put that out there too. So slide, please. So as Lisa mentioned, one of the primary initiatives of the Data Curation Network is enhancing the expertise and skills of the emerging data curator community. And the first step we've really taken in support of this initiative is through the development of a peer-to-peer learning program funded through the Institute of Museum and Library Services. Slide. Thank you. With this funding, a subset of institutions involved in the DCN, including Cornell, Duke, Michigan, Johns Hopkins, Minnesota, Washington University in St. Louis, and then Penn State, have created an intensive 2-day hands-on curriculum that engages attendees through lectures, group activities, and demonstrations. Slide. And our learning outcomes for each workshop are focused on ensuring attendees come away with an increased understanding of data curation practices, of course, using different tools within various disciplines and data types, a location or a home to really share their own expertise, and then the ability to meet like-minded colleagues in sort of a small group setting. And this, of course, really facilitates in-depth conversations around data curation and different services that are provided at an institution or organization. Slide. So this is just an example of the workshop agenda that we held at Johns Hopkins in April. The program really starts off with a little bit of context by what we mean by curation and what activities curation involves. So through the Data Curation Network within our initial planning grant, we identified over 47 different data curation activities, including both human curation activities as well as things that are provided through technical infrastructure. So at this point, like workshop participants also reflect on and discuss their motivations for curating data, as well as within their own institutions or organizations' reasonings for why curating data is important. We then walk participants through each of the curated steps and have them try it out, essentially. So it's a lot of hands-on activities. During the first day, we also introduced the concept of a primer to explain its meaning and use, and to also let attendees think through what kind of primer they want to work on for the next 6 months after the workshop ends. The second day continues the deep dive into the Curate Steps and also includes a significant amount of time for drafting a primer roadmap and how the primers will be scoped and eventually published. Slide. So as Lisa already pointed out, this is kind of an overview of the curated steps. We want to check the files, understand them, request them, augment them, transform, evaluate, and document. Slide. I thought it'd be helpful just to provide a few more details about the hands-on activities that are happening at the workshops. We provide the attendees the ability to choose between some fictionalized data sets. This one was provided by, this is Cornell, I think, yeah, and the Big Red Bear. This is a lovely data set about honeybee colonies. And the other ones include a range of data types, including survey, tabular, code, image, and geospatial data. Not all of them have the themes related to our institutional mascot, but some of them do, and it's kind of fun. Slide, thank you. For each data set, the groups walk through the general curated checklists and discuss how and if they would conduct the recommended activity. And as Lisa kind of already mentioned, these steps and activities are listed kind of linearly, but in practice we move around a lot. We jump around in between the steps, and then some of them obviously don't apply. Some of the feedback we've received from other groups is like, you know, there's certain components within the checklist that didn't apply to the data set, and we obviously see that. These are just kind of general practices. And they're definitely not rigid at all. It's meant to be sort of like a flexible thing. And you can hit like forward 6 times, Lisa. So these are just the, the breakdown of each step and the activities within them. So just a few numbers. Our first workshop, we received 44 applicants, and we brought in 22 attendees. From this, 7 primers were published earlier this year, and Hannah's gonna talk more about those in just a second. We held our second workshop in April and had 56 applicants with 27 attendees. And from this, 13 primer groups were formed, and we expect these primers to be published kind of like end of November, early December-ish. Our next workshop will be held at Washington University in St. Louis in early November, and we have some great kind of primer topics that have already been suggested, and so that'll be pretty exciting. Next slide, please. So looking closely at the details from the applicants from the second workshop, we see a broad range of interest across institution and organization type. And even internationally, we see people having an interest in attending these kinds of educational opportunities. Next slide. And for workshop 3, we're seeing the same kind of trends. Next slide. Finally, feedback from the workshop indicates that attendees have found value in learning the curated steps. They're excited to work on primers, network with other individuals, and applying the curated checklist at their institution. You can hit it a number of times, please. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Hannah to dive deep into the first set of primers, which were just published.
Thank you, Cynthia, and thanks again to everybody for joining us today. I'm just going to try to go through and describe our curation, the process of creating the data curation primers, and then a little bit about the primers themselves that are published. Next slide, please. And this just kind of shows an overview of our primer creation process, which is, it's about a 6-month process. And the primer topics are selected at each workshop through a brainstorming activity. The individuals are then able to sign up for groups. Each primer group is going to be given a roadmap and template, and then DCN mentors are assigned to each group. So these groups will meet about once a month for that 6-month period. The primer drafts are submitted about halfway through the process for a peer review, which I'll explain a little bit more in a moment. And that co-occurs with an internal webinar. Revisions are then made based on the review recommendations, and then final submissions, once those are revised, the final submissions are published to GitHub. Those are the living documents. And then the archival copies are going to be published to University of Minnesota's Drum. Next slide, please. So what is a data curation primer? Data curation primers are concise, actionable resources that are meant to assist data curation in adding value to a data set. So essentially those are going to be, back please, sorry. So essentially those are going to be short practical documents. Next slide, please. And this just kind of shows you a snapshot of an actual primer, the Jupyter Notebooks primer that is published to the GitHub repository. And you can't, of course, see all of it because of the length, but that just kind of gives you an idea of what it looks like. If you go to the next slide, this will give you a little bit of an idea of what some of the contents are. We have informational tables in each of these primers that kind of give you an overview of what you're going to expect in the primer. On the left, you see the primer template. That's what's given out to the groups. And then you see the Geodatabases Primer. You can see that they didn't necessarily fill out all the fields that were on there. And that's okay because the primer template, it was just kind of a suggestion. And there are, of course, going to be things that might not apply to a specific format or topic. So it's certainly okay to modify that. And if you go to the next slide, please. You can see also in the example table of contents. So we have a table of contents for each of these, and you can see from the left, from the template, how the Geodatabases Primer had modified what the suggestions were, and they have different levels, for instance, showing different topics related to metadata. If you go to the next slide, please. So a little bit more about our peer review process. So again, the primers, they're going to be formally peer reviewed halfway through the 6-month process. And they can also be additionally reviewed if that's needed. And sometimes that happens if maybe one of the primer groups, if they got off to a slow start. And we try to be very flexible with people. And so if it needs a second review, we'll go ahead and do that. So the reviewers will include both present and former DCN workshop primer group participants, and then also all of the Data Curation Network members and any of the DCN workshop instructors. And to the right, those are just a sample of the questions that we ask the reviewers. And we just kind of keep it very open, and our reviewers have been very good about giving a lot of detail. And a little bit more, so one of the things that we typically have them do is to find a sample data set that the reviewer can use with the primer, so that we have an idea of how this will actually work in reality. So we try to find an example of an uncurated data set, either in a specific format or whatever is going to be relevant for the curation topic. And we just have them use the primer and kind of give us some feedback on the results for that. Next slide, please. And then once the revisions are made and the final document is ready for publication, again, we put the document both in GitHub and in Drum. The copies in Drum, those are just the archived primer drafts. So that is only the version 1.0. GitHub was our choice to host the living documents because you're able to interact with that. We wanted the community to be able to be involved with that. Because we expect the primers to grow from their original version. If you go to the next slide, please. And again, this just shows, oh, no, go back. Thank you. This just shows again what it actually looks like in GitHub. So you see on the top there, for instance, like with issues, we're able to interact with the community that way. You're able to fork the primer, create a pull request for it. You can watch the primers if that's a topic that you're interested in. If you go to the next slide, please. And then now we're just going to get into a little bit of an overview of the existing published primers. These again are from the first workshop that occurred out of the 2018 DLF Forum in Las Vegas, Nevada in October. So this first one, the Geodatabases Primer, and I just put, as far as the things that I put about it on the side there, just a little note, those are all taken from our final sharing webinar, the Primer Palooza with RDAP. So I do have a link on there if you wanted to see the groups actually share out that information. But I just kind of put like a little snippet on here just so you can have an idea of what's in there. So Geodatabases gave us a little bit about the major benefits of their primer. And if you go to the next slide, please. And this one is NetCDF. And this was kind of an interesting primer because we already had a NetCDF primer that was created prior to the workshops through University of Michigan. And this primer is sort of a sub-primer to it that gives an example of NetCDF. So it has a link in it to the original NetCDF primer and kind of goes through step by step with some visualizations of how you would curate NetCDF. The next slide, please. And then for SPSS, that is a statistical software. And one of the things that they had found in there that I thought was rather interesting, or one of the things contained within the document, is they had conducted extensive interviews for this one. So it's really interesting to read through there and see what they found from the actual researchers. The next slide, please. Microsoft Excel, this group, they had found that there were no specific metadata standards, so they give some idea about what documentation you should have and to try to gather from the depositor. They also did something rather interesting that kind of caught on. They were the first group to take our curated steps, which Lisa and Cynthia had discussed before, and they modified them specifically to the format. So that's kind of caught on a little bit, and you'll see that, especially with the upcoming group of primers, that a lot of people have really expanded on that idea. If you go to the next slide, please. And for Microsoft Access, I thought it was very interesting. He found that the simple databases could be curated more so like a spreadsheet, but he gives a lot of good ideas for preservation on here. Next slide, please. And then Jupyter Notebooks, and if you watch our Primer Palooza, you'll see the code is not data is very prominently displayed on there. So one of the interesting things that they found was the different metadata that may be used for different situations. Next slide, please. And the WordPress primer, and that really kind of covers the online version of WordPress, wordpress.com rather than wordpress.org. They also modified the curated steps from the DCN to specifically curate WordPress. And it was a more extensive description of that. So that's actually in a separate document that we're going to be putting into a separate part of the repository on GitHub. The next slide, please. And then this is just kind of a preview from our second workshop that occurred at Johns Hopkins University back in April. These are the different formats and topics that the groups are drafting their primers on. Next slide, please. And we also just wanted to thank again everyone that was involved in this project and in creating these primers. Again, many thanks to the DLF Forum for having us adjacent to them last year in October. If you go to the next slide, please. And also thank you to everyone that participated in the second workshop that occurred at Johns Hopkins University back in April. And we do expect those primers should be ready for publication sometime in mid to late November. They're just right now finishing up their peer review process. The next slide, please. And we just also want to invite everyone that's on the webinar today to join us in sharing your expertise. These primers on GitHub, you're able to comment, you're able to create a pull request if you have some ideas for changes to these. In the next slide, please. And we're also available right now to answer your questions. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Hannah and Cynthia and Lisa. We've had some questions come in. Just as a reminder to others that may have joined a few minutes late, if you can please enter questions into the Q&A box, and then I am collating those and I will read them out and prompt for discussion that way. With a group this size, it's too difficult to manage individual microphones, etc. So I appreciate you taking the opportunity to ask questions via the chat. So I had a number of questions come in. Some of them were similar in essence to others that had already been asked, so I've grouped them a little bit. And some of them I think are kind of in order as the presentation went, but then other people added questions later, so it might go back and forth. So I'll leave you to decide who's the most appropriate person to answer the question. So the first question was about the way that the network functions, and I think that this got amended. So the first question was, as a curation network, do you support curation for other repositories in the network? And then it was added, I think this was answered. So does a data set end up in the repository affiliated with the subject matter curator assigned to it, or can it then be submitted to a different repository?
Yeah, I can try to clarify that. So our curators will curate the data sets submitted to the network. They will curate the data sets, but the data sets will stay with their home institution. So the data don't actually get deposited to somebody else's repository. It's only curated by somebody who might work for another repository. So a good example of this, so if Minnesota receives a data set where we don't have either the expertise or the capacity to curate it within the time frame that we give ourselves, we could submit it to the Data Curation Network, and it might get assigned to Penn State, who has somebody who could be, a really good match for that data set based on their expertise. So they'll review it, they'll mark up all of the changes that should occur for us to finalize the data set, and then send those changes back to us. And then we'll work with the author to finalize the data set for our own local repository.
Great, thank you. Okay, next question. How are you recruiting members to the network? How does my repository participate? And in a related flavor, is it possible to join the DCN as a dataset reviewer?
That is a great question, and something that we have been actively trying to figure out as a part of our sustainability planning. Right now, because we are in a grant phase that goes through 2021, we are very slowly adding new institutions to the network. We're being quite intentional about it for really trying to bring in people who have the expertise that might be missing from the DCN so that we can make sure that we're covering all of the different fields of data and software types of data that we're seeing. When we do move out of this current implementation phase, we do hope to provide a number of different opportunities for people to be able to join the Data Curation Network, perhaps as an institutional member. I'm also interested in that idea of how to join as a dataset reviewer. I think the individual participation could be really interesting because people leave organizations or they change organizations, but that doesn't necessarily mean that any of your personal interest or expertise is gone. So creating different avenues is right now one of our main goals for people to be able to participate. And these workshops are another avenue that we're trying to make available for everyone to come together and participate in this type of project. So short answer is we don't have an opportunity right now for new members to join, but we are conceiving that and developing that right now.
Great, thank you. And actually your answer ties into another question, which is what is the longer term or post-award plan for sustaining the data curation network?
It's one of the biggest, hardest questions for any project to try to answer. And it's something that we are working very closely on. We just did actually a couple rounds of market research with our sustainability development partners over at Lyrasis. They're helping us work through a lot of these questions and develop a model for how a project who is currently sustained by the volunteerism of all of our current members, how can we make that transition to something that will continue to grow and sustain? So we are open to other people's experiences and ideas. I would certainly welcome an opportunity to talk with those who have interest and experience in this area and want to offer us some advice.
Great. Moving into the data sets, have you considered adding a note to data sets that were reviewed using the primers or some sort of badge that indicates that they are a curated data set?
Does someone else want to take that one? I don't want to hog the floor here.
Yeah, so how the primers and the primers have been used is something that we're actively trying to think through, like how essentially as a form of assessment and then to also track their use. It's not something that we've kind of like established a workflow for or have a process in place, but I do think we have like a recommended citation, but where exactly we see that being placed within any sort of curation documentation has not been articulated. I don't know if Hannah or Lisa, you have thoughts about that as well?
I think the idea about badges would be really incredibly useful to be able to label a data set as, you know, curated as following this protocol or this procedure and be able to cite that protocol or procedure, I think would be a really valuable addition to what we're trying to do here. So
those are excellent ideas to incorporate.
And somewhat related, is there a way to test or to measure how comprehensive my data set descriptions are? How do I know that I'm writing quality metadata?
Mm-hmm. I know we've been talking about this too. We've been trying to develop a rubric that tests whether or not a data set is well described and you know, what all might we want to test for. Actually, we've been talking to a number of different folks in the field, and particularly people who've worked with DataONE. How do we learn from the metadata quality suite that Ted, I'm sorry, Ted's last name?
Haberman.
Haberman developed. Yeah, I think there's a couple of different examples that we've been really impressed by and hoping to learn from, to pull in to be able to test out, you know, whether or not the data has been well curated up to a certain standard.
Yeah, I was just going to mention the quality suite. So in kind of an extension answer to this question, within DataONE, Matt Jones and Ted Haberman have been working on this quality suite, which assesses the completeness of a metadata record. And it's been implemented at a number of repositories, and the suite can be customized for the repository. So if one repository wants to check, you know, metadata item A and another repository wants to check metadata item B, they could do so in customization. DataONE are currently customizing it to create a FAIR suite that measures the metadata up against the FAIR principles. So that might be a future thing to look at. So it's not repository specific in that way, it's more generic and it applies to the FAIR principles.
Yeah, and Amber, I just want to highlight something that you mentioned. I think it's so important for it to be adaptable to the different repository environments. That's something that we've certainly experienced with the Data Curation Network, where each institution, each repository really does have that needed difference or that needed layer of complexity. Not always with the metadata. I think maybe we could standardize there a little bit better and that would be beneficial. But in terms of how we process and what is our local level of curation standard could be a little different.
Okay, so I'm going to pull up this other question since we just started talking about DataONE a little bit. And one question was, how might DataONE as a network of repositories collaborate with the DCN as a network of curators?
I really like how that's phrased. That's exactly the question, right? Yeah, we in the DCN have really tried to focus ourselves on being, focused on the curators, that human layer of the repository stack, and really, trying to span across human expertise, not necessarily diving into some of the repository functionalities. I definitely would love to see some opportunities for our network, DataONE network, and maybe other networks to be able to collaborate more on this. And I think right now, sharing out what we're doing with each other is that first step. I think there's a lot of forums where we can come together and talk more about ways to increase curation standards for repositories. I think there's still a lot of fuzziness about what does it mean to be a curated repository and not a curated repository.
Right.
I think Cynthia, you maybe had something else to mention.
Yeah, all I wanted to add was that I think like the primers and then definitely the education component is some place where we can see some collaboration too, either with DataONE as sort of like this larger organization that supports education of data management. I think that there's some natural alignment there too.
I think that the final thing I could think of too is just really how do we advocate for the role of data curators in this space? It's not just about researchers sharing their data, but there's actually a professional component of the individuals who are behind the data repositories who are making that sharing happen, who are making data shared in a fair way. And that's a really important professional role, and really showing what that work is and advocating for that work to funders, to journals, to our institutions. I think there's a real area for opportunity to collaborate as well.
And on the theme of collaboration, are there any connections established between the Data Curation Network and GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, and Darwin Core Standard for Data Transfer?
Not currently. I think that, again, there's a lot of opportunity for collaboration. I could see, some of the ways that the Data Curation Network has been really expanding kind of our focus. We curate data for our local repositories, but that's not only where many of our researchers are depositing. They're of course using the well-established national repositories and international repositories. So we've definitely been looking for ways that we could support data sharing in those domain-specific repositories like the one you just mentioned. So I think it's really about hammering out some better workflows, and also talking to the researchers to figure out at what point in their process would they be interested in that level of support for curating the data, going to those repositories. Or does it happen afterward?
Thank you. I now have a number of questions that relate to the primers. Starting off with, these primers are great! Exclamation mark. What are your next software data formats queued up for which you're going to write a primer?
Do you think that are they asking about the next ones from the Johns Hopkins workshop, or would this be the pitches that that we're getting as part of the application process?
Open to interpretation. It's,
well,
I think they're just interested in knowing which software or data formats you're going to be tackling in your next primers.
Well, in the next group that we're having, so we have some qualitative data analysis software formats, Atlas TI and NVivo. There is going to be one on confocal microscopy. Spss is another statistical software that is being covered. Let's see, then there's character text encoding is another one. And what am I missing, guys? R.
That's going to be a big one. For us, at least, we're seeing a lot of different R files. Lighter point data, I'm looking at the list here. And Tableau, that'll be really cool. STL files. And of course, PDF.
And then I also want to mention that we're also developing some primers internally in the DCN. So right now there's a human subjects interest group that is meeting to develop one on a human subjects essentials, I think is what starting with, and then it may branch out into other human subjects topics. And that's kind of interesting because we kept talking about the primers being formats, and that's not a format. So that's really a topic, and that's something that the primers can also be, and we're trying to figure out how to modify that topic into our template.
And somewhat related, oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to ask Hannah, do you remember like the range of primers that are being pitched for the third workshop? And maybe putting you on the spot.
Well, what do you mean by range? I mean,
just like examples of
just some examples. Oh goodness. There were a number of people that were interested in qualitative data. So that was a little different from the other ones. I want to say that when we started these, and I really only have the data from when I came on in the project back in last October. It seemed like it was more geared towards the hard sciences, and so I thought that was something that was interesting. I'm seeing more people in the social sciences wanting to be involved in this. And besides that, I think there were also some, I'm not sure what I would call them as a group, maybe like a complex imaging, as sort of the images that might be associated with instruments that are used in health and medical studies. So there were some of those. I think there were some 3D images, were some also some pitches.
Okay, and then I have a question related to the primer for MS Excel. So I saw you have a primer for Excel. Do you in fact encourage use of proprietary formats such as Excel rather than non-proprietary such as CSV, TSV? Do you use OpenRefine for handling spreadsheets?
I just wanted to tackle that first part. The Data Curation Network has not been advocating for use of a certain file format to date. What we try to do is tackle what we get, what the researchers are using. So we're seeing a lot of researchers using Microsoft Excel files, and in the Data Curation Network, part of the recommendations generally for Excel is to consider conversion into the non-proprietary formats. But usually we recommend this as a supplement to the existing Microsoft file. So we won't, just convert and then leave out the Microsoft Excel file. We'll keep both. And that's primarily for functionality's sake. There's a lot of additional functionality that you're going to get out of that file. And that conversion is never perfect. You're not perfectly pulling over all of the data. And I will point out there's a tool that we've been using here at Minnesota called the Microsoft Archival tool. And that was a tool written by a graduate student of mine. It is only for Windows, I will note, but it does do the conversion for you. It will convert all of your Microsoft files into CSVs, but also capture all of the other additional information that might get lost, like images of the graphs, any formulas that were embedded in the spreadsheet, and also any formatting that was used, so highlighted cells, for example. So we try to do our best to work with those files, but then also develop new solutions to help us as curators combat the long-term usability of the files.
Thanks. At the last of the primer questions, are there any primers developed for biodiversity observation data, such as museum collection data?
That's a really great idea. Not so far.
Okay. Another question. We do still have a number of questions, but we may be cutting it off in a moment as we're nearing time. But it says, maybe you've already mentioned it, but could you estimate the average time it takes for full curation and peer review of a data set to get it published? I understand it might be difficult, but many times depositors or researchers are pressed for time. They need a DOI for their published data set to get an article accepted in their journal, etc.
So there's a couple different answers to that question. All of our institutional members have turnaround time expectations for this process. Some of us try to turn around a data set within 2 days. Some of us have a 5-day expectation. Researchers certainly do want to see their DOI first off. I think that's one of the main reasons a lot of people are publishing their data to get the DOI to put into a manuscript. So that sometimes happens before the curation process is complete. So that can sometimes alleviate some of those concerns. But when we do the actual curation work, right now we're averaging about 2.5 hours per data set of curator time that's going into the review and assessment of the changes that might need to be for that particular data set. That's the average, though. It can range, you know, it could take less than an hour, it could take many hours depending on the complexity of the data sets. If you're working with a couple thousand files, it really can get up there. However, the 2.5 hours usually is spread out over a couple of days too, because you do have to do a lot of back and forth generally with the author of requesting, you know, missing files or something like that. So those are the averages. You know, again, it just really depends on the file type.
And I just had a follow-up come in to the Excel question. Can you repeat the name of the Microsoft conversion tool and indicate whether it's openly available? Yeah, it's on GitHub. It's called the Excel Archival tool. I could try to find a link and share it with the slides if that's helpful. Great, yes. We'll pop that link onto the webpage when we put the video up. Thank you. Okay, next question. Article reviewers can get credit for reviewing papers via platforms like Publons. Do you envisage a way to add a carrot for reviewing data sets by being able to provide some sort of credit? I would love to add that person to our team, because we're actively trying to figure out incentives and badges and ways to really demonstrate the credit for our curators. And I think that's a really excellent example of some of the parallels that we see with the data curatorial review and the article publication process and for peer reviewers. So that's a good thing for us to look into. I will fully disclose that that person might already be part of your team. That's Amanda Whitmire that entered that question. I think she's been involved with you guys. Hi, Amanda. Sorry, Amanda, for outing you. I don't normally do that. Yeah. Okay, a couple more questions. They just keep coming in. I should mention that any questions that we haven't got to, we will be adding to the discussion forum where we post the video online at thatDataONE.org/previous webinars, which will be up later today. And the team here have indicated that they will continue to respond to questions that come in from remote viewers or people asking questions in the next 24 hours. I'm going to ask this one last question, and then I have a couple of points of order with respect to some DataONE before we leave. So there is a parallel USGS-based program, the National Vegetation Classification. Is there any effort to coordinate between DCN, DataONE, and this standardization effort? I am not familiar with the National Vegetation Classification, so I'd love to learn more. Is it for metadata primarily? Or is it, I mean, I guess I'd be curious if it's a shared staffing model similar to what we're trying to do. I am also not familiar with that. So maybe we can continue this discussion in the forum. And so speaking of a couple of questions that came in about DataONE, someone was asking, is the West Big Data Innovation Hub part of DataONE? The short answer to that is no. I would love to look into that more. And then also for those of you that are new to DataONE but involved in this community, what is the logical first step to connect with DataONE? I would suggest reaching out to me, Amber Budden, so AE Budden at dataone.unm.edu, and I can put you in touch with the most appropriate person within DataONE. So with that, I would love to thank Hannah, Cynthia, and Lisa for joining us today and this rich information about the work that the Data Curation Network is doing in their workshops and with their primer development. It really is very exciting, and I think there's a lot of opportunity there for collaboration with DataONE, but with these other organizations listed, and then also it sounds with the community to become involved, and maybe that is part of the sustainability plan moving forward. As I mentioned, the webinars run monthly on the second Tuesday of each month, and next October 8th, we will be hearing about Wholetail and publishing tales to DataONE repositories. Look forward to you all joining us, and thank you again, Hannah, Cynthia, and Lisa. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thanks.